Hi, and welcome to another online lecture for economics. Today, we will obviously be going over what I call market structures. Again, you need to watch the video, take some notes, be ready to ask questions in class, and answer questions in class. So to begin with, let's talk about what is the definition of a market. A market, as you can see, is basically any place where consumers and producers come together. It's basically, again, the equilibrium graph of demand and supply coming together to agree upon a price and a quantity to buy and sell those goods or services. Obviously, anytime you go to a store and you buy something, it is a market, but also a school. If you remember back to elementary school when you traded food in the lunchroom, that was a market. And of course, today, most of us do a lot of one of the biggest markets is online. So they can be in a variety of places in our society. Another thing just to remind you, of course, is the importance of money. Money obviously makes markets work much more efficiently and effectively. We could use other forms to trade, but we have obviously agreed that money is the most efficient and effective way. So that's what makes money so important. The next thing we talk about are market characteristics. These are 5 different kind of elements, if you will, that you can use to determine what kind of market you're dealing with, because there's not just one type. I think a lot of people assume there is just one type, and that is incorrect. So we will quickly go through all 5, so then you can use it to evaluate different markets and determine what kind it actually is. So the first one is this. It's number of sellers. And of course, this is pretty straightforward. It just means how many people, or I guess suppliers, producers, are there in the market. It can range from as low as 1, obviously, all the way to thousands and thousands of producers offering a good or a service. So there can be quite a range. So just keep that in mind. And what we'll do is we'll go through all the different characteristics and then clarify the biggest types of markets out there, or the most important ones. The next things I want to talk about are product differentiation. What this basically refers to is the idea that to determine a market, you have to look at how different are the products in that market. In other words, there can be some markets where the products may be very different, maybe really unique. Yet in other markets, like for example sneakers, the products honestly are very similar. The difference mainly comes from styling, color, shape, but they all do the basic same thing. They cover our feet and they give us support. Now, of course, we'll talk about in a minute about how different are these products and where do we think these differences come from. The next one is what is obviously the ability to enter a market, and that is simply how easy is it for a new business to open up in this market. So when an entrepreneur has an idea and wants to enter a market, how easily can he or she do that? Is it quite difficult, or is it relatively easy? To compare that, what I mean, first of all, think of airline industries. Imagine what it would take if you wanted to start up your own new airline company in this country. Imagine all the 4 factors of production that you would need. Obviously, you'd have to have an idea to make your company different, but also you would need the planes, you would need the mechanics, the pilots, the rights to the landing at different airports, the gates. It would be an immense undertaking to enter this market, and that is why obviously you don't hear of too many new airline companies opening up on a yearly basis. On the other hand, imagine how difficult it would be to open up a new restaurant that sells hamburgers. I imagine that most of you out there can make a pretty decent hamburger. You could easily get access to the raw materials, obviously, ground beef, condiments, buns, etc. And you could open up a restaurant pretty easily without much difficulty, especially when you compare what it would take to open up a hamburger joint versus opening up a new airline industry. So that's obviously the difference between the ability to enter the market. Next, let's talk about advertising. Obviously, advertising exists, as it says, to basically, on the one hand, supposedly to inform us about the product or the service, to tell us what is the difference between one product and another. And that is true. Yet, I think you also have to ask yourself, what else is advertising doing? Are they really clarifying the meaningful differences between the products? Or are they being more subjective about why if you buy this product versus that one, that somehow you'll be happier, smarter, that you're a better person? And we will get into this a lot more. But as you'll see, different markets have different amounts of advertising to try to convince us to buy the good or service. The next thing is influence over price, and this is pretty straightforward. It just asks how much does one company control or affect the price that they can sell their product in. Of course, in an equilibrium graph, we said producers should have almost no control over price. But obviously, we're going to find out here that that's not necessarily true. That in some markets, producers have quite a bit, if not total control. One key vocabulary term that I want to bring up now is the idea of collusion. Collusion is basically where businesses get together kind of behind closed doors and they agree to sort of set a minimum price that they want to sell their products at. So imagine if all those airline companies I just mentioned got together and promised not to sell a ticket below $400. Well, if they all agreed to it, then we'd all be stuck with paying at least $400 for an airplane ticket. In our society, collusion is not accepted, and actually it is completely illegal in this country. Because obviously, if you have collusion, then yes, you don't really have competition between firms, and we all as consumers pay higher prices, and there may not be as many choices or innovations or inventions in that market. So the key here is this last point, that the fewer firms in a market, the easier it is for them to collude. And every couple of months, if you look at the newspaper or the news, I should say, you will see that the U.S. government has fined a company or several companies for an attempt to collude. And so this is something that still goes on today, but our government is very strict about not allowing this to happen. Okay, so here's some key things we need to go over now. Going over those 5 key characteristics, you will notice something very clearly, that the number of firms will affect the level of overall competition, and that will affect the prices that you and I as consumers pay. So here's a very basic little flow chart. The more companies you have in a market will lead to more competition. And obviously we already know if you have more competition, prices for consumers will go down and choices will go up. And of course the opposite is true. If there are less companies, then there's less competition, and you can expect to pay higher prices and not have as many choices in what you are buying. So that's the key overall point to make. More companies in a market is basically better. Less companies is worse. Now, we obviously know what the impact on consumers is. We want more choices and we want lower prices, so more companies is better. It also is actually beneficial to the producer. Okay? Producers have to basically, if they know there's lots of competition, they have to use the limited resources, the factors of production, in an efficient manner. They can't be wasting labor or land or capital, because they know, just like here, there are many different cell phone providers, and so you cannot just sit back and just waste resources and as such. Also, you will always need to be coming up with better and even new products that your competitors don't have, and so innovation, inventions will be continue to be pushed on to consumers because of the number of other companies in the market. So there we go. Okay. Now what I'd like to do, I'd like to very briefly say what are the major types of markets. And the best way to do this is to have you draw a continuum, a line, and as we talk you'll be able to label or put the markets on this continuum. On one end of the continuum we'll have a market where there'll be one seller, there'll be basically no product differentiation, there'll be little to no advertising, and the company will have total influence over price. Obviously on the other end we'll have the exact opposite. A market with many sellers, there will be some product differentiation, there will be lots of advertising, and the companies will have very little, if any, influence over the price. So let me just, in the next few minutes, go over these major types of markets. And obviously some of them you're going to recognize right away, others will be maybe not as clear to you, and some of the vocabulary is a little tricky, but I'm sure it'll be okay if you watch it more than once. So here we go. First one, which is one that most of us know, is monopoly. Obviously, just like the game, it states there's only one seller, one producer, and there's no other substitutes available for consumers to go to. They, as you can see, basically have total complete control in this market, and no other company can enter the market. As you can see, there are certain examples of this in our society. There's only one company that offers you sewer service or fire protection and police, and so there are examples of this in our market. And I've mentioned this before, the two that they do advertise, but really it's only for image. They don't really need to advertise because consumers don't have any other choice, so they have to buy their products. Pure monopoly is rare. I'll go over a few examples, local examples that you'll notice, but in reality, not many exist. There are two. If you've thought about it, if you remember what I've said, Xcel Energy is a monopoly. It's really the only business that's going to offer electricity to you. And also Denver Water, another private company that offers you water. Now, to be said, of course, while these are monopolies, they fit the characteristic, they are very heavily regulated by the government. There are committees that are formed up that watch what they're charging people, and anytime they want to change what they charge people, they have to get authorization from that committee. So it's not like they can go out and do whatever they want. There's still lots of oversight and regulation. But there are these cases that we allow these companies to exist simply because it's more efficient use of our natural resources. We wouldn't want 4 or 5 electric companies building their own utility poles throughout the city, or have 4 or 5 water companies all digging their own pipes to everybody's house and having them switched over every time we decide we want somebody else's water or somebody else's electricity. That would just be a waste of raw materials. And so it's more efficient to have one company for each of these products, but again, to heavily regulate them. Okay, moving on. Examples of monopolies, if you may have not thought about, is the NFL. You can't just start off your own football team in a city. You have to go through them. The only time they allow to have more than one NFL team in a city is if they think the population will support it. That idea of a local monopoly is, think of a gas station in a small town. Okay, if there's only one gas station in this town, they can charge to some degree whatever they want because they know people are kind of dependent on them. And so that's an example of monopolies that do exist in our society. But again, for the most part, monopolies are not allowed to exist. The government will break up a company that they believe is trying to attempt to become a monopoly. The next thing is what I call oligopolies. An oligopoly is a company where there are a few sellers, such as you can see, airlines. Now, a few sellers means it can be obviously more than one, and that could be up to several dozen companies. But the products are very similar. I mean, when you go on an airline, the seats are pretty much the same. I mean, you sit down for a few hours and you go to a new city. That's basically it. I mean, a seat is a seat. I mean, first class and second class, sure. And they try to convince you again through advertising that somehow going on Frontier versus United is a huge difference. But I don't think anyone's ever taken an airplane ride and said, wow, this one company's seats, and wow, this was such a different airline experience. For most of it, they're all basically the same. Okay. So again, like I said, there are dozens of buyers usually. I should say dozens of sellers in this market, excuse me. And again, the differences in the product are pretty small. Really, some service and location and brand name, but that's really it. Okay. Moving on to the largest type of market that we have. Well, I could say here's an example of cars, I should say, in an oligopoly. You can see there's not that many cars. There's only 12 major automakers that sell in this country, and that doesn't include my favorite, of course, the most recent one. Before Tesla, the youngest car company was 92 years old. So this is a very hard market to get into. All right. Now, the other cool key things to oligopoly, of course, is that the price is controlled by the sellers. They do potentially have the ability to manipulate the price to some degree because there aren't as many sellers in it. But again, it is really hard to enter this market as I've made clear. And again, there is the issue of collusion. This is most often where you're going to see it. That there's a few companies, a few dozen, and they can secretly or in the open get together. Here is the symbol for OPEC, that organization that basically controls world oil prices. They can get together and decide how much to pump or how much to slow down, and that can manipulate the price, and that would be collusion. If they did that in America, it would be considered illegal, but they're not in America, so it's not illegal. Again, the most biggest form of market is monopolistic competition. It's basically, the products are pretty much the same thing. There's a huge use of advertising. It's pretty easy to get in this. Basically, if you go to the mall, any store you see there is going to be basically monopolistic competition. So that's basically the majority of companies that you and I deal with on a daily basis. And as it says here, they have some control of price, but not very much because there's so many other choices for us. Perfect competition, you can read through. It basically isn't as important because it doesn't exist too often, only in a few short things. And I need to go to the next slide, so pause this if you need it. And finally, if you look at the graph, you will see that we go from perfect competition, from an opposite competition to